here. It's nice and great, and that's one of the great things I find here at East Anglia, seriously, that actually the CCP and School of Economics very well go together and are intertwined very much. That's much better here than at Tilburg, I can attest. Without so much further ado, this paper is called From Economic Power to Political Power. It is joint work with Ivan Komianin, who is a bright student at Tilburg. And 1.5 years ago, so we had this idea, and you will see why. Let me just explain, because this basically tells all of the motivation. A year ago, one to 1.5 years ago in Brazil it was. So there's a story. What's the story? The story is called Elon Musk versus Supreme Court of Brazil. Musk has this platform X, former Twitter, you know that, right? I mean, he invested more than $44 billion, I guess, to buy it. And there's lots of disinformation and hate speech that's happening globally, but it also happened in Brazil. Now, in early 2024, the Supreme Court of Brazil actually ordered X to take down certain pieces of information, certain hate speech stuff, and block some accounts. And also to appoint a legal representative in Brazil in order to become accountable, because apparently the company had one legal kind of result, but it was not, it had no legal representation. Well, Musk refused the order of the court, citing free speech arguments. He said, look, we cannot restrict these people, these poor right-wing people on X, and so free speech is more important, so we will not do it. We will not block these accounts. Then there was among the the Supreme Court judges, one especially prominent one, Alexandre de Moraes, so leading the court's actions, and he accused Musk of undermining democracy and labeled him an outlaw. Then the Supreme Court imposed a nationwide ban on X, said, okay, in Brazil, X cannot be accessed by anybody anymore, and also froze Brazilian assets of Starlink, which is another Musk-owned company providing satellite-operated internet services, which are in particular important in the Amazon region, which is super rural and hard to get to with pipes internet and so on. Well, and this went back and forth, and only after some weeks, Musk gave in, and X finally complied with all the judicial mandates, and only then the court released the ban on X, and the X could be accessed here. Okay, so questions that arose here. I really I followed this a little bit through the news and thought, how dare he, right? And that's basically the question of the paper. So, in a little bit more academic words, the question is this a special case? Because where a private individual openly challenged the authority of the sovereign democracy's highest judicial body, and because he just did not.
Is that Musk as a private individual, Musk as a multinational firm?
Excellent question. It's both. So, he never signs it with this title or that title, but he gives speeches. He has an X account himself, and he openly comments on all kinds of stuff. But of course, then he turns around and is the CEO of this company and that. So Musk not only disregarded court orders, but also publicly encouraged Brazilians to circumvent access ban. Right? So you should not, come on, let's revolutionize this terrible Supreme Court is not good, and we should do something against that. He also used his satellite internet company Starlink to resist enforcement. How did he do? And if X was banned, then he said, oh, how terrible. And via Starlink, he kept access to X open. Right? So definitely defying the court orders of the Brazilian Supreme Court, but technically he could do it because satellites are out of reach for the Brazilian court, which is bound to the earth. General questions. How can we explain that an individual feels comfortable confronting orders of the Supreme Court? Is there more than hubris or irrationality to it? So is this a special case? Is Musk just crazy? Or is there maybe a wicked reasoning behind this? Does it foreshadow a future where certain individuals do not feel constrained by law, social norms, or morality to pursue their goals, but where they basically, as individuals equipped with lots of power in all kinds of dimensions, feel happy to confront these powers?
I thought that was now.
Say it again?
I thought we already have that situation.
This is one piece of empirical evidence. I will bring you a bit more, and I will try to rationalize. wise. That's the big thing. What problems would be associated with such development, and how should it be contained?
Should you acknowledge that you own a Tesla?
Say again?
Should you acknowledge that you own a Tesla?
Whether I should acknowledge? Yes, I do own a Tesla, and I do have a sticker on the back that says I bought this before Elon went crazy. And our new car is not a Tesla, exactly for this reason. So importantly, most of these questions are theoretical, and so what do we do in the paper in order kind of also to go beyond kind of the level of kind of newspaper conversations? Basically, we develop a series of game theoretic models, starting super small and simple and getting a little bit more realistic. By having a look at the equilibrium features of the final model, of the fifth model, kind of, and doing some comparative statics, we can identify 6 characteristics which kind of are more conducive toward a situation where a firm/private individual might feel encouraged or bold enough kind of to confront kind of a government. Based on that, we construct empirical hypotheses, and based on that, kind of we do not really test these hypotheses on data, but we go back to Musk versus Brazil, and we have a look at several other cases, both those involving big tech firms and those involving not big tech firms, trying to distill a pattern out. Right? And then in the end, kind of we derive policy conclusions, and that's basically what the paper does. Yes. So. First, what I will do kind of is to give an intuitive account of the model, and then because it will depend a little bit on the time, kind of I will run through the models, but only kind of superficially, because I would like us to have some time at the end to discuss, particularly regarding applications. So what's the gist of a model, of this model? Kind of there are 2 players, a government G and a firm F. The government G needs to invest scarce financial resources into public infrastructure. So think into water, into energy, into internet access, and that's costly. If it kind of does not kind of invest enough into infrastructure, then there will be some consumers/voters who are unhappy. Right, that's clear. And if these voters are unhappy, there may be a political cost, political repercussions for the government, right? Because these guys say, hey, we don't have internet access, or we didn't get proper energy. We all have all these blackouts. Not good for the government. G also needs to invest in alternative use. So that can be a healthcare system, it can be rearming kind of the defense forces. Some countries urgently need a new presidential palace. I mean, there's all kind of alternative uses for money that the government has, right? So there is a trade-off for the government. And this is exactly the point, kind of the government has these constrained resources, has to do public infrastructure, and now kind of a firm comes up and say, hey, for a government, I can help you. I can co-provide some of this public infrastructure. And thereby kind of you can take some of the money that you had to kind of invest in public infrastructure, and you can buy something else, new arms or whatever, what else you want to do, right? I want to provide the infrastructure. I, the firm, want to provide the infrastructure for a bit of a profit, but that's not so terrible. And I mean, because that can be regulated, and it can alleviate the government's problem. Sounds nice. The problem is, what if that firm is not only a profit-maximizing firm, but also has a political agenda? And if that political agenda is kind of in conflict with the government's political agenda. For instance, because it fuels societal damage via promoting anti-democratic parties or kind of any stuff which is bad for society or for the political landscape of the country. Right? So then kind of clearly there's a trade-off for the government. What do I do now? And so here, besides the public infrastructure, the firm can also invest in an action, and this, of course, without any further kind of things in my head, this action is called X, that hurts the government's payoff if I invest in X, because X supports illegal activities or undermines the country's political institutions, so which would cause societal harm. Assume that the government has the capacity to effectively shut down X if they want, because that's not the kind of, this is not a model about whether they can enforce the ban or not. This is kind of about, a model about kind of incentives to get their interest. Now, what kind of in the end do we show based on the model? First, kind of this harmful political action X is never established in equilibrium if the game is played only once or repeated only finitely many times. This may look like a very dull game theoretic result. It is not, because it basically suggests only if the game is repeated infinitely many times. In more mundane words, if these two partners G and F have a very long-term relationship where they also both sides intend to work together in the long term in the future, and where we cannot foresee that for whatever reason the relationship should break down. Only then, as we will see, only then, if this long-term view exists, then the threat of the implicit threat of the firm actually to establish X has bite. We also show that the government will not forbid X or accept X if the additional utility it obtains from the first co-financing of public infrastructure is higher than the societal damage that X creates. So, and for this I will show you a mathematical expression. And this mathematical expression to some extent is the key, which is reflected in the paper's title. Because this additional utility that the government obtains from a firm helping it with public infrastructure, this determines the economic power that the firm has. And this will serve as an upper bound on the political power, which equals the societal damage that the government is willing to accept in order to get the co-financing of public infrastructure. Yes.
Just a quick one. So how crucial is for your story that this is about public infrastructure? Because the reason I'm asking is because I think most of the economic power of, let's say, Elon Musk is not because they provide public infrastructure. It's because they provide a service that, if we want to link it to what the government doesn't offer that service. For example, social media. So if it's not so important, that maybe it's just how you present it, how you wrap it up. I just don't really see that this is to do with, okay, here's a gap. This part of public infrastructure the government can't serve because it's not profitable. So someone else will come in and do it who can do it maybe cheaper. And that's why for them it's profitable. So it's a bit like our universal service provisions. So postal services in the UK. Small villages don't have post offices anymore because it's not worth it. So in that case, of course, private companies don't come into doing it. But I think that's, in terms of the public infrastructure, I just feel it's a really niche thing. And that's actually, I don't think that's what gives these firms the economic power.
All fair points. I could reply right now, but I will wait until the model, because seriously, that's the beauty and also I would say the justification for having a model here, because in the model, it makes things very clear. And then you will also see to which extent really public infrastructure is needed or something else could also be interpreted as my
Okay. Can I ask, so the utility that say citizens, which are not here, but they receive of public infrastructure is zero. But when the infrastructure is not there, it's minus infinity. So you can look at that utility, but one problem you're facing here is that people don't value the infrastructure. Regulation is not valued. And when the regulation is not there, you start complaining. But you take it for granted that the infrastructure is there, it should be there.
Here the model, as you will see, is very simple. Basically, the government sets a share, either alone or together with the firm, a share of the population that is served with the public infrastructure, and those people who are not served, they get angry, and everybody has one vote. And so basically, the higher the share of unserved demand, as I will call it, the higher the political cost. Could somebody open the door, please? The higher the political cost for the government. That's the simple assumption.
So just a clarification question. Are you really speaking about governments or are you speaking about states?
Good question. In the end, I'm talking about states. So, but I'm also you will see one of the key parameters is a governance parameter, which captures how democratic a state is and how how vulnerable the state actor is if citizens get angry. Right? And so a politician who wants to get reelected clearly is at the mercy of these voters, and hence has a high kind of incentive to serve them. Somebody who's a public bureaucrat and who has tenure for 30 years and has 10 more years to go maybe doesn't care so much. That's good. But this is also, again, that's the beauty of the model. It makes things explicit. Okay, so let me get there. So, okay, I said kind of based on this kind of we derive comparative statics and derive 6 empirical hypotheses about situations where the firm has political power. And oh yeah, and foreshadowing in Musk versus Brazil, all 6 are fulfilled. And so this is really kind of that was not made up, but kind of this is an outcome of the model basically. And in the end, like, oh yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised, but it's reconfirmed there. Okay, so here's the model, and as I said, I will try to speed up a bit in order to have. There are 2 risk-neutral players, a government G and a monopolistic firm. I will show you 5 models, and so in the first model, we do not have a firm, we only have a government. The government can invest in infrastructure, that's I, which a cost of infrastructure CFI upon X, easy. When the firm comes in later on, we assume that's what Peter already conjectured, that the firm is more efficient. So the government has an investment cost CFI, and I will work also throughout this example, throughout this presentation with an example. My example is that the cost function, the investment cost function for the government is just I, my investment squared, easy. And the firm has tau times I investment squared, where tau is between 0 and 1, right? So that's therefore, if you see tau, if tau is low, the firm is very efficient. If tau is closer to 1, the firm is not so efficient as compared to the government, right? That's the idea. And I assume demand is 1. And then kind of in the baseline model, as you will see, kind of the government is good government in the sense that it wants to maximize welfare. And what is welfare? Welfare is basically the how many IG, so the investment of infrastructure, what share of the population gets access to the infrastructure, minus the cost of producing that, right? So that's productive efficiency, completely one-on-one minus. And then this also creates unserved demand. So if if my demand is 100% of the population, but some of these guys are not served, then yeah, I have unserved demand, and as you will see, that makes them unhappy. So model 1, neoclassical public goods provision. Here, the government, there's only a government gets in and wants to maximize total wealth, just to have a benchmark result, right? If I now work with this example that I told out, then in this specific example, kind of, we would have first best investment level of 1/2. So 1/2 of the population would be served, the other one would not. Okay, not important. Second one, now the government also has the political motive. What does that mean? It wants to maximize welfare, so investment minus cost of investment, but also it gets a kind of political damage, where the political damage is unserved demand times kind of effective gamma. Gamma is the kind of the governance parameter, and this is already kind of answering some of the question, because this gamma can be very nicely interpreted with respect to the political system. High gamma is a democratic system, because in high gamma, and if I substitute this in here, if gamma is high, then unserved demand really makes the government unhappy. Why? Because it loses votes on the next election. Right? Putin probably has a very low gamma. He doesn't care, or nearly doesn't care, right? So that's not his main concern. So if there is some unserved demand because he needs to spend all his resources in Ukraine, it's not so terrible for him. Right? That's basically what the model captures. Then, as we solve this, then here we find that the equilibrium investment that the government will set is not 1/2 as it was in the first model, but 1 plus gamma divided by 2, right? Which is clearly larger than kind of the original investment level, and which also already tells us, okay, the higher gamma, so the more accountable the government is to the population, the higher of an investment level it will set, and so the more people it will serve, or it will want to be served. That's model 2. Now model 3, a firm enters. And the firm says, hey, government, I offer you to co-finance your public infrastructure, right? And how does that work? The government would equip the firm with a license, say, hey, firm, great. You do this part of infrastructure, 30%, I do the other part, 60% or 20%, whatever. And then in the end, kind of I save some money. You can make some profit on the on your kind of customers. And how exactly do we do that with a profit? Here, for simplification, I assume that kind of the government basically regulates the price per consumer. What does that mean? Kind of also the firm will operate under convex costs. And if at some point I set kind of a regulated price, then it is that the government, that the firm can charge to each of its consumers, then kind of a rational firm would say, okay, I extend. Here, kind of once my marginal cost of production equal the price, I will stop providing further. So this is how much kind of profitably the firm would produce for the market. The government understands this function, and hence by setting this price can, in a very fine-grained way, kind of regulate how much kind of infrastructure the firm would produce and make some profits, and the rest the government would produce. That's the principle idea. Now, in this case, we would have a three-stage game. So where first there would be contracting. So the firm signs a contract to supply capacity, IF hat. Whenever you see that, that's only contract for a unit price of P. Then the government determines its public investment. And finally, kind of the firm decides how much it really wants to invest. Important difference. Kind of first, the firm promises, oh yeah, I produce 20% of I serve 20% of the country's population. Then the government does something, and only later on, kind of the firm kind of can decide whether it really wants to kind of keep up with its contractual obligations, or says, no, I don't, or whatever, right? So that's the critical structure. I had some discussion in the paper, kind of why this structure makes sense. It has to do with that. With the fact that contracts are concluded very quickly. It's easy, you can sign something. That kind of building public infrastructure takes long. And so basically the government has to make a decision how much it wants to supply before it knows how much the firm really wants to supply. And this is what is captured in this sequence of actions.
Isn't that kind of automatically making the firm powerful because it's the last move?
But yes, I mean, so I give the firm some power, that's true. And you will see it doesn't help them at all. But this model, it doesn't help them. So that's because what we find here is kind of in this game 3 is, so first, so we already know kind of from game 2 what the total amount of investment is that the government wants to have in the country. And then basically it splits this in two parts. Kind of one part is what the firm should deliver, and the other part is what the government itself will deliver. And it will depend on tau, on how efficient the firm is. The more efficient the firm, so the lower tau, the higher kind of the share that the firm will deliver. So specifically, you will see that kind of the government will produce this part kind of multiplied by tau, whereas the firm will produce exactly the same factor, but multiplied by 1. Right? So the higher tau, basically the lower tau, the more efficient the firm is, the lower the government's share is. Right? So that's the and so economically, it just makes sure that kind of that the final marginal unit that is produced comes at the same margin cost for both of these firms. Right? So that's equally stuff. What do we find? Kind of, I mean, forget the technical part, but what is important in this setting, obviously, the firm makes positive profit, so it wants that. Firm likes it, yeah. And secondly, this says that the utility for the government with firm is higher than the utility for the government without the firm. So, the government likes it too, because it now has some money free for other kind of purposes, and kind of it has somebody else in kind of doing this who is even more efficient, right? So sounds like a really good choice to get this firm on board, right? That's the sugar deal. We will show later on that this is exactly the problem, that it is so sweet. So both benefit. Now, game 4. Up to now, kind of we had only profit maximizing firm, and here kind of all the kind of the bashes of capitalism. Capitalism sometimes is beautiful because then profit maximizing firms in game 3, they do what they're supposed to do as long as they maximize their profits, right? The problem is here now it gets murky. Now this gets more like real world, and this is kind of where the firm also has political motives, kind of on top of its kind of profit motives. So now the firm can invest in this action X for a very small cost side. That's not so important, but kind of can invest in X. If it can invest there, and if it is not forbidden, then it would get huge political payoff X. But I mean, the firm loves this political, whatever it is. We assume that this political this political benefit for the firm is higher than the profits in one period, so it's really motivated to get there. But the problem is that this generates a conflict between the firm and the government, because kind of the same acts that is nice for the firm hurts the government's payoff, and specifically it hurts the government to affect the row acts. Right? So to some extent, if rho was 1, then this would be a complete zero-sum game. But in principle, rho can be anything. It can be smaller than 1 or larger than 1. And that's not important for now. But it's important kind of that whatever the firm does, great for the firm, not great for the government. So yeah, that's societal harm because of illegal activities or whatever. I mean, we can interpret this rho and this X in a ton of ways. I will not do that. Now, how would this affect the timing? Very close to what we had by now, but a bit more extended. So first, there's the contracting stage, kind of promises to deliver some IFT, kind of public infrastructure. Then the government sets its infrastructure, IG. Then, this is the new part, the firm decides whether to establish X or not. If it chose to establish X, then the government can say, no, I forbid it, or it's okay, you go ahead. And also that is costless. And finally, the firm would set its true infrastructure level IF. And this can coincide with the IFN or not. They have to see. It's kind of, if you're a little bit familiar with kind of contract theory or so, then you already see this is a perfect hold-up structure, right? So, and this is an endogenous hold-up problem right now, which creates all of the economic kind of interest and stuff. So this is game 4, but this is played once. Now again, we solve a subgame perfect equilibrium. We solve it from the back. So we started at stage 4 and so on at stage 5. And what you see here is if this is the final stage, the firm has to decide about its infrastructure. And it makes profit with it, and there is no future. Of course, it will serve kind of the market because that's just profit. Knowing this, if we go back to stage 4, even if the firm established X, the government can just forbid it because that even so the firm could, in principle, the firm could say, look, government, if you forbid my X, then I will renege on my contract and I will not co-finance will co-invest into the infrastructure, and then you, government, will have problems with your voters. Do you really want that? And here the government can be very cool and say, yeah, I don't care. Why don't I care? Because I know that you bloody profit maximizing guy, and you will set your profit maximizing investment level in any case. You will sell to the consumers because you love it. You make money with it, right? And you have no way whatsoever to commit against that. So basically, in this game, what we will find is the firm will, in the end, will invest. The government would forbid X if it was there, but knowing that it would be forbidden at stage 3, the government, the firm will not even dare to establish X because it comes at a small cost side, so it wouldn't matter. And stages 1 and 2 are also the same than as before. So here, if I compare games 4 and game 3, now the profit motive of the firm is there, but it doesn't make any difference for the economy. That's important, right? Despite the fact that the firm sits here, the firm at the end, it could come in and could punish or could do whatever, but it has no right. So because of backward deduction, that's what I just said. Kind of any threat of the firm would not be credible because everybody knows they will want to maximize the profit anyway. And so the outcome is identical to game 3. Or in other words, X is not established, the government is fine, the firm will establish something. So now, let us think. What exactly are the characteristics of this situation? If you imagine you were the firm, what could you do basically to convince this government to allow X? And now we could go several avenues, and some of the enforcement costs. What we will do here is basically draw on institutional economics and also on repeated games. And the idea is very simple. In the end, the game has to be repeated infinitely many times. What does that mean? It basically means, if I go back to the timing here, that this timing is played once, and then we go back to stage two, to stage one, we do the same again, and again, and again. And in every period, we think that there is a next period, or maybe even many next periods, right? And therefore, the problem that the firm had here, that everybody knew stage 5, there was no future, and consequently, it will only maximize its profits in this round by serving the market. Now, maybe it can construct a strategy which says, okay, government, if I establish X and you forbid it, I will punish you. And how do I punish you? I do not produce anything here. And if I do not produce anything here, then we will have a problem with the consumers.
Shouldn't tax be affecting gamma in a way?
Affecting gamma.
Yeah, because it came out with the idea, that company, what they are doing, what you started at the beginning, they are affecting democracy, and which is the redistributions, to get, so in a way, your acts in a static case will affect gamma will be endogenous in that way.
I admit that's a great idea. We have not implemented it. So endogenizing gamma and that's one way of interpreting the X. That would be a fantastic extension. We have not.
Are you assuming that, there's obviously been a big dispute about whether the backward induction theory is really correct, rational or not? Are you assuming that the kind of is it the same sort of model that would say that people never get anywhere in the centipede game?
I'm not sure.
Well, in the sense that it's been controversial. Whether there's standard. There's sort of one version of standard game theory says backward induction argument is correct, because people are fully rational, and then there's a counter argument that says no, it's not, and goes back well.
Okay, so probably so the methodologically this is very standard. It is standard. It can be standard in the sense that there are no behavioral assumptions here. This is.
But it's not a behavioral. Well, it's not a behavioral assumption. You see, it's an assumption about. But we'll talk about it. It's a question about whether the backward induction argument can be justified by any coherent theory of rationality.
Okay, that's a fair point. I do not go into this.
But I'm asking, are you effectively assuming that it can be so? Are you assuming that your agents have a rationality?
Yes.
You do. Okay.
So this is of course methodologically that's a big feature. Repeated games can be a bit tricky because you see this. So basically what we're doing in game 5. Game 5 is the same as game 4, but just infinitely repeated many. So what do we, how do you solve such an infinitely repeated game? Basically, you write down a candidate equilibrium strategy for each of the players. So I have 2 strategies. This is what I call F star. So this is a full plan of action for player F. First, how should player F play in period 1? And then how should player F play in every period after 1? Knowing that in every period, F would have to decide something in stage 1, what contract do I write? In stage 3, do I establish X or not? And in stage 5, how much public infrastructure do I really want to produce? Then I have to write this down for all contingencies. And the same thing, next slide, looks similar, is the firm strategy. Again, firm has a strategy for period 1, but here for stages 2, how much public infrastructure do I produce, IG, and for stage 4, do I forbid X if it was established or not? And then here the same thing. So, and you write this down, and then basically you check, given that the other player, so for instance, this is strategy G star. So this is the strategy assumed for the government. Now, if I'm the firm, do I have an incentive to deviate from my own, to change my own strategy F star in order to maximize my utility or not? And then in the end, and this I will not bore you with that, but the clue is then, of course, that you show, given that G plays G star, F has no incentive to change away from F star, and vice versa. And which means we have an equilibrium. So I hope that replies to your question. I completely agree that this is a bit special. But that's, I mean, that's kind of game theoretic toolkit, and I mean, there are some good reasons why this would make sense. Of course, I mean, the sheer mass of stuff, the conditionalities and what and so, and this is I think cognitively very much kind of challenging for any human being. But now, if I boil this down, kind of, and I mean, I do not ask you to read this, but what I boil this down, what it implements is basically the following. These strategies give each of the players a tool to punish the other one if the other one does not do as they should. And now, basically, the question is, what should they do? And here, from the firm's perspective, is I want the government to accept that I established X. And so basically, this strategy F star establishes that whenever the government forbids my X, I will punish immediately in the fifth stage by producing nothing. I have equal to 0. And consequently, then kind of the government will have a problem because it has high unserved demand and political damage and will not like it. And then, so the question is, kind of, this is basically what is happening here. Kind of the question is, under which conditions is this threat of the firm to produce nothing? Which also means that the firm itself makes no money at this stage, right? So I'm cutting myself in the arm, only to let you kind of suffer, right? The question is, when is this kind of credible? And the answer is, it is credible kind of if the long-term utility that I get from kind of I cut myself in the arm, but this kind of makes you kind of comply with what I want you to do, namely to accept my X, and consequently, kind of my long-term utility will be higher than my short-term cost. That's I mean, in economic intuitive terms, that's what it says.
We go back on the previous slide, actually. So it seems to me that the degree of democracy here plays no role for the decision of the firm, unless it's inside IP. I don't know. Is it inside IP?
No, I mean, this is all in general terms. Kind of the degree of democracy comes when I introduce basically when I substitute the example thresholds.
Okay.
Exactly.
That's what you have to do.
Yeah, but Franco was quite right in pointing out that the degree of democracy is not static. So.
Okay, so in this model it is static. And to be honest, if I go back to my example, within Brazil in the year 2024, I think also it was static. So
Well, yeah, I guess if you're talking about like you could say in a particular piece of time, I'm wondering, is there any way to account for external forces? Because you're pretending it's only one firm and one government.
Let's come to that later.
And it's not necessarily
I mean, right
like.
now, kind of, I mean, this is complicated enough, kind of, but
Yeah.
we are still kind of in the realm of only a model. And then later on, we will kind of interpret it and try to see, okay, now let's get a little bit more realistic. What can we learn from it in general, and also for situations that you have in mind right now? And then we can see maybe does help us to understand.
Yeah, and also I'm wondering if we're talking about infrastructure that is much more fixed, like, is there a way to account for how easy it is to stop producing in that state where you go zero?
This is not in the model, but you will see it in the
Okay. Because some things are easier to cut off than others.
Yeah.
So my only concern here is that, in a way, when I look at your model, especially model number 5, it doesn't seem to make much sense that gamma is static, right? Because you can think of gamma as also a reflection of the sort of competition that you face at home. And thus, you may be willing as a government to eventually accept some cost in a certain period if that doesn't jeopardize your ability to, for example, remain in power in the following period.
I mean, we can think of many things. Gamma, I mean, technically, in this, as I said, I think this is really the beauty of the model. Gamma is the parameter that determines how important the unserved demand of the users is for the government or for the decision maker.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, maybe there are ways for the government to even signal, I'm the defender of democracy. This will be fantastic for me in the next elections, right? That can be. Then we have to reinterpret the gamma here. But in the end, kind of, this is what the gamma does in the model.
I understand, but if you are repeating the game several times, it seems very odd that gamma then remains exogenous to the game.
I mean, right now, kind of, I'm here, kind of, it does not matter so much because, I mean, I said subgame perfect equilibrium, but basically, I'm talking, I'm looking for a kind of, how's it called? It's not called. It's called static. I forgot the term. Kind of it's a static. But basically, where I'm looking for a situation where we have the same outcome every period. I'm not kind of, I mean, so there's no flow variable which changes in the back, and then where we can see we are kind of converging towards full democracy or away towards autocracy. That's not the purpose of it. I mean, now its point is not the steady state that Michael debate.
So it's not an ergodic model, it's not repeated, but I would definitely encourage you to think about it as a differential game of this thing, because this is where the action is. And I'm worried about the way you're modeling this, because the policy implications will be very different. So Elon Musk wants X to make sure that they control the government, because they want to have leverage over the government, irrespective of the information of the AI. And if you do that, then what the government or the regulator should do is make the gamma contestable and open competition in mass media, but not in public good provision as in investment. So the model is beautiful, it's elegant, it's a nice story, but then how helpful it is in understanding the regulatory next step. This is where.
Perfect question. Let me just jump there. Okay, because kind of I understand what you say, or basically, I mean, the endogenizing of gamma makes a lot of sense, but it's a different model than this, right? So it's a different type. So basically, so just what we show is kind of that the conditions under which it would be incentive compatible for the firms kind of to cut itself in the arm and to kind of to not produce any output and leave profits on the table after X has been forbidden. And kind of now it says what this depends on, what's important. And then maybe even more important, kind of in stage 4, the incentive compatibility constraint for the government. Because the government says, well, it's this inequality. The government says it will not, or the outcome is the government will not forbid X and accept it if the additional utility that it obtains, that is this. So this is the government's utility if the firm does what it contractually agreed on. Thank you. Kind of the difference between this term and the utility that the government gets if the firm is not there at all, and kind of the damage is pretty high, right? So this is the additional gain for the government if it gets the firm on board and the firm plays nice. And this is what we call economic power. And of course, I could now basically with the example term, it is exactly this. So here you see also this increases in gamma and it decreases in gamma. I mean, that's what you want to see here. And then this must be at least as large as the political damage or societal damage that the government is willing to take. And as long as this is fulfilled, then the government says, okay, X or firm F, I don't like you at your X, but I'm willing to accept it because the damage is smaller than the benefit of having you on board, right? Which boils down to this kind of for the big stuff. So and then this would be economic power, that would be political. That's basically the language we talk. Now, based on this, let me run. 6 hypotheses of maybe okay. So one comment, and of course, kind of if I were to follow your kind of advice, then basically the government would be even stricter, right? Because the government would say, okay, if I accept X now, this would be kind of the period damage that I have from X. But in the future, if kind of X is established and gamma decreases, so then I will get, or something else happens, and the media is more and more controlled by this foreign firm, then actually this will increase over time. So this constraint would be harder to fulfill. However, the structure would still very much look the same. I'm pretty sure about that. Would be more kind of integrated because you really could solve for another threshold of gamma and so on. Maybe have 3 categories, but that's the gist. So what did we show? So the threat of establishing X increases. So establishing X and accepting X increases if, first, the country is a well-developed democracy. This may be quite surprising, right? So democracies are at higher risk than autocratic countries. And here again, that's how do I know? Because the left-hand side is increasing in gamma. And this just captures that if in a very democratic country, the government is very dependent on citizens who are happy, right? That's the very purpose of, or the way how democracy works. And consequently, if the firm overnight says, oh no, I don't serve you anymore, and we have many unserved, lots of unserved demand and many unhappy customers and voters, not good for the firm. So that's here, being a democracy makes you vulnerable. Similarly, if the country is poor or highly indebted or in crisis, but the government needs resources for something else. I didn't know that exactly, but that's very clear, because then the government's utility of money, basically financial resources, increases. That makes it more vulnerable. Similarly, X is established more easily if public infrastructure sector is an innovative high-tech industry, for instance, a digital market. How do I know? Going back, you have the efficiency parameter tau, right? And if the firm is very efficient, tau is small. If tau is small, this thing increases, right? Meaning in industries where the firm really has a big efficiency advantage over the government, this is where it's easier for the government to accommodate them. So more likely, because it would just be so great to have the Starlink bring internet service to the Amazon region, and otherwise I have millions of angry people in the Amazon. It's also, the problem is if the firm has tremendous financial resources, if the firm only has political motives, that they weigh strongly against economic motives. And finally, this is not from the model, but this is by extension if the firm has only limited assets in the country, the firm's owner does not reside in the country. Why is that important? Because otherwise, let's face it, if Musk would have been in the country, they could just have sent a couple of policemen over and put him to jail, right? That would probably increase, that might affect his incentive compatibility constraint a bit. But if they cannot get hold of the guy, or of some crucial assets, anything that hurts him, it's more difficult, right? That's very straightforward. Okay, so these are basically the empirical hypotheses. Now we can first review the Musk versus Supreme Court case. Okay, just remind us all, much is, at least at the time, I think he still is, the richest person on the planet, heuristic 4, who mainly resides in the US, outside of Brazil, heuristic 6, who just strongly, in 2024, strongly and openly supported the extremist political agenda of the US presidential candidate, Trump, at the time of the conflict, so which is characteristic 5, and defied orders of the Supreme Court judge in Brazil. Again, this is 6, right? So he resides in the US, and the problem was in Brazil. Now, what about Brazil? Brazil is an emerging market economy. However, behind all of this, I have references. But it has apparently slow-burning fiscal problems, so money is an issue. Interestingly, it's a pretty well-developed democracy. So it ranks 57th out of 167 countries with a democracy index score, and published by The Economist, of 6.49 on a scale to 10. But importantly, in the category of electoral process and pluralism, it has its scores 1.58, which means elections work pretty well in that country, which is also pretty evident from the outside, because over the past 20 years, I guess the identity of the president has changed twice or 3 times, right? Between Lula and Bolsonaro. So that's that. So meaning, okay, so maybe there's something to it here. So high, economically questionable, but democratically, oh yeah, pretty much on top. Now, finally, the market in question was internet access, where Musk's satellite internet provider Starlink offers significant efficiency advantages over in the ground pipes, especially in remote regions, which we have lots of in Brazil. So that's characteristic 3. Meaning, if we take it together, for this case, all 6 characteristics have been fulfilled.
I have just general question. It is often the case that some very rich people are interested in economic power, but they don't follow necessarily this route. They use corruption, for example. One of the first cases was Berlusconi in Italy, right? He got elected, so he got a lot of power that he actually used for, to promote his own businesses. We've got Trump. So I just wonder then why a person like Elon Musk doesn't go down that route as opposed to this one. I know that your model this specifically, But there can be many other ways to actually achieve better outcomes, I think, right, without necessarily being so confrontational. And to me, in the model, you are capturing the fact that he's very confrontational. And I just wonder whether there's other ways to model this in a more, that sort of applies more generally. Does it matter, for example, that he owns not just a digital platform, but X that reaches many people, for example? I don't know, that was my question.
Great question. The paper does have answers to all of them, I guess. I do not know whether I have the time to bring it, to convey them. My interpretation is, because what I will show here, okay, this is again to which extent the case fits, but let me just skip that. First, there are some other cases which are similar in nature, not as confrontational as Musk versus Brazil in the Supreme Court, but they go down the same route. Google and Meta in Australia, there was a new law in Australia, I do have slides on the background, but I will not have time to go to both. There was a new law in Australia, basically requiring Google and Meta to pay fees to Australian newspaper companies.
Requiring them to go to bargain.
And yes,
It's a critical difference.
And so there was and they refused, and then also Google gave in at some point, Meta didn't. So that there was quite a struggle. Same thing, OpenAI versus European Union. Here the thing is that when the EU suggested its AI Act 2 years ago, then Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, came along and said, oh boy, this is way too restrictive. There was way too much regulation here. If you really implement these rules, we will be out. It was only bluff. But that was the conflict. Basically, it was a threat. We want something political from you. If you don't give in, we will leave. Basically, but that's the entire mechanism that is modeled. Right? First, I can give you something, and ideally, I already have prepared for it. I mean, in the case of making ChatGPT accessible or not, that's pretty easy, right? And then the threat is, if you don't give me what I want, I'm out. That's the level. And finally, also a really interesting case is Starlink in both Ukraine and in Gaza. In Ukraine, where there has been quite some political turmoil about these cases, and where in Ukraine, that at some point that was critical fighting between Ukrainian army and Russian army, and Ukrainian army has internet access via Starlink, and at some points Musk openly considered to shut it down, and that would have been pretty terrible for Ukraine, right? And then some people say, okay, is this really good that a private individual without any democratic oversight and so on, any legitimacy, has so much power? And again, the mechanism is there is a public infrastructure, and I can either provide it further or not. I decide. In Gaza, the outcome was separately, because in Gaza, actually, first Starlink did provide internet access, and officially for international aid organizations, and then the Israeli government came in and said, no, you're providing internet access to Hamas. Then Musk gave in. So Starlink does not offer services in Gaza, exactly for this reason. Now, what is important here, these are all big tech cases. These are all digital industries, and this is part, I guess, to the answer. And this is fundamentally different than what we had 10, 20, 30 years ago. There has always been corruption. Berlusconi has been around, and yeah, Berlusconi also had, as we know from several great papers, media impact. But via TV, relatively old school, if you want. Right? This is digital industries. This is basically with one push of a button, where Musk can turn off or on internet access above the country, and that is a technological power of a scale that is unprecedented. And yeah,
I think
we have 4 minutes, and then we stay in the question.
Okay, let me finish this. So the first thing is we do see some of this reflected in other big tech struggles. That's the first one. Then where always the firm exploits the dominant in essential services, it has some public impact, and so on. Now, actually, I wanted to see, is this really confined to digital industries? It is not. And as also, UK has known, and several very traditional infrastructure industries like water or energy there have been struggles all over the place, including cases, I mean, that I've documented here from Canada, US, from India, and from UK. Thames Water is one of them. However, the interesting feature is that here, in each of these cases, the water company or the utilities company came to the regulator, to the government, and said, "Oh, if you want to regulate us more, which costs profit, then we will not provide this." Right? But it was always profit oriented. There was not a political motive, and that's really interesting. And all of the cases I could identify, classical profit maximization. From that perspective, it's straightforward. There was no political mention. And from that perspective, Musk versus Brazil is indeed a special case, which is recognized by the model. Let me conclude. Economic power can be transformed into political power. The suggested mechanism is private firm first invest in public infrastructure, helping the government. How great is that? And then later on threatens to withdraw if government does not give it to its political goals. We identify 6 facilitating factors and have policy implications, which are pretty much straightforward. Let me leave this on here for the discussion. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So now we open the floor to questions. But those that want to leave now, please can leave. The seminar is officially closed, and then now we will stay here for a discussion for those models. Thank you so much. That was brilliant and then very, very engaging, interesting. Yes, please, Sally.
This is very timely, and we were just talking yesterday about X's now implementation of Grok for all its content moderation and recommender system. So removing all of the things that you used to be able to get transparency over, like the heuristics, etc. And what kind of reaction the European Commission would have given the DSA, and both thought, well, but if the European Commission goes hard against them for that, they could do something like cut off Starlink to Ukraine, right? So this was yesterday, the conversation that we were having. So I think that the infrastructurality of it is very crucial, and maybe what makes it public infrastructure as opposed to a private service might be an interesting thing to think about in terms of the power that it plays. But fundamentally, I'm wondering why you needed that model to arrive at those hypotheses, because those hypotheses are already quite prevalent in a lot of political science literature, on blogs, and in foreign affairs. I mean, I was wondering why you need the model. What exactly does the model?
I mean, the model. That's. I think this is the beauty of any model that does what it's supposed to do. It's that it identifies the variables and the forces which really play which influence a specific situation. I mean, take the gamma, right? Here I can say very clearly, higher gamma leads to more dependence on the foreign force. And now the question is, what is gamma? Okay, gamma is dependence of the government, public decision maker, on the happiness of voters.
I think you would really have to play that out empirically across a lot of cases in order to be able to make that claim, because how it gets spun to the public is going to be fundamentally important as to whether or not that removal of that particular infrastructure is spun as something that is not, because you depending on how it gets communicated and who the public interprets is at fault for that absence of the thing that benefits them.
So
it's really going to be crucial.
Baseline thing is that in the model and in reality, if there is a service that people want to consume and they don't get it, they're angry. And so the question is whom they make responsible for it.
Right.
But one of the options is that they make government responsible for it, right? And that's the channel that is modeled.
But one of the options is also that they don't, right? And it depends on who the government is, and massively who controls the media environment and who's sending the most messages, because you can guarantee that if Orban, nothing would be his fault at the moment, and nobody would understand it as his fault because he controls all of the means of communication in the country, right? So it would really you know, and I'm just thinking that it's you couldn't say definitively that this would be based on a model.
Okay, so
Yeah, I mean, it's
the model based on assumptions, right?
yeah.
Yeah, can we get two questions together and then decide yours? So let's say there is a one line first and then we go.
Yes, please.
You should be able to speak up.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Sorry, Helen, we've got a problem with the room. You're not coming through to us. Let me try the settings for a second.
So let's go with the question. Yeah.
In a very big.
No, just following up on what you said, because I was wondering why not take into consideration how polarized the Brazilian society is. Because when we think about the Brazilian federal court, Alexandre de Moraes, for example, there's a lot, like those who support Bolsonaro are already against the Brazilian federal court, and Apex because they were in federal court. So why not to take into consideration the levels of polarization of the society? And not just that, for example, Starlink at the Amazon, even though the legal Amazon covers 52% of the territory, the population there is very low. The concentration of the population in Brazil is the southeast Brazil, so state of São Paulo, state of Minas Gerais, state of Rio. Amazon, there's a very small population. So I think there are these factors you may take into consideration.
I can only say, of course, kind of empirically, right? I mean, what I have read, because kind of the population density thing is something that came up earlier, is I cited somewhere in the paper, kind of that politically, apparently the treatment of the Amazon region is weighted higher than the population density should suggest. It's like in many countries you have whatever minorities or so, which in the end have more political weight than their sheer size suggests. So it must be something that apparently politicians cannot completely, right? And that's also kind of one of the numbers I moved over very quickly, is that at the time, Starlink in Brazil had only basically 200,000 or a bit more than 200,000 subscribers, which is not a lot in a country of 200 million people, right? However, these 200,000 subscribers very often were in remote locations, which then would leverage, where one kind of internet access point kind of would be used by many. Regarding the polarization point, you can think of the gamma as cut away those people who are very much on the pro side or on the con side, and they would not update rationally at all. And kind of when they made their decision whether to support the government or not for other factors. And now zoom into those who are willing to have a look at the world. Then this is my population. Right, that's a nice thing in such an economic model that you can kind of interpret. You can right now zoom in, and then maybe the kind of the population that's relevant for the next election will not be 200 million people, but maybe only 30 million people. I don't know, but this is then what this counts.
Yes, so the Helen was.
I think we've solved the issue now.
Helen, then there is Corrado. There are 4 more questions, basically.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, it works. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Jens. It was a very useful framework for looking at an interesting topic. So it strikes me that your framework fits best to settings where the government relies on the firm to make some investment. But your motivating examples come largely from situations where the firm controls some platform for mass communications. I mean, certainly your Elon Musk and X and some of the others that you mentioned, which I think have particular features that are actually somewhat distinct from simply relying on them to make an investment. It's that they control a very important asset for communicating with the public, which of course can have political implications. So this sort of put me in mind, there was quite a lot of literature in the 2000s of sort of political economy aspects of media. So combining the sort of, micro IO structure of the media sector with political questions. I mean, the main focus there was of the role of the media and then government censorship of it. So I mean, I know it's quite a contrast in what you're doing. You've assumed that the government is acting on the behalf of, you know, whatever the social welfare optimum is. Whereas in that literature, you know, the government is acting in its own interests, isn't necessarily motivated by social welfare. I mean, your framework could easily capture that as well. I think you just don't need to assume that, you know, whatever the government is controlling with this X is necessarily in the public interest. It may just be in the government's private interest, but you'd have some interesting angles there. One aspect of that literature, which I think you could potentially develop in what you've got, you've assumed that the firm is a monopolist, but sort of begs to me the question, what if there's competition? What additional angles does that bring? So in that media literature, I mean, take something like, you know, Besley and Pratt, Handcuffs for the Grabbing Hand, which I think is a lovely paper in 2006. They look at media competition, which can actually make it harder for the government to control the media because they've got to essentially buy off every media outlet rather than just.
I get that point. However,
Monopoly
I think
helps the government. You know, you could have interesting angles, I think, in your work as well of bringing competition.
Okay, so first, I guess in many infrastructure industries, due to the fundamental kind of economic characteristics, there's only one provider. So competition may not. There may be kind of a competition to get into this monopolistic kind of position, and there may be access pricing and what have you. But in the end, very often, kind of it's only efficient to have one provider. So there's something here. I guess what is important with respect to the model economically, I said that before, there's a hold-up problem. So the hold-up problem implies that the model works as long as the firm has the opportunity, basically at will, to reduce its own kind of contribution to the service, right? And this could be by not servicing existing physical infrastructure. It could be by pushing a button and the digital infrastructure doesn't work. It could also be, have a look at the final point that I just opened on the slides, and I have not talked about economic statecraft, where kind of entire countries, China being most prominent among them these days, kind of invests a lot in other countries, but which follows exactly the same economic mechanism that what I have outlined here. First, investment in the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, in many ports in Eastern Africa and South Asia. And then you could say, oh yeah, but ports are so physical, they could be easily seized by the home governments if there's a conflict. Yes, the ports can be seized, but then there is a part which is human resources and kind of technological infrastructure, which the home countries do not manage. They don't have the expertise, and so they completely rely on China. And kind of again, it's the digital. That goes back to your question. I think really that kind of the power of digital technologies that unfold right now, and it will only increase with AI. And that this is so big that all of the problems that we might have had for decades are now really leveraged and increased tremendously. And only that's my interpretation of what I read here, only they kind of suggest to the most powerful actors like Musk that, oh yeah, it could be okay to push the button and to confront kind of a Supreme Court.
3 more questions. I think Corrado, and Bob.
Going back to much of the discussion, I love the model. I think it's great, beautiful, fantastic for teaching, but I don't think you capture what the real world problems are, because the real world problems are following out of political institution, following achievement of economic power. And the policy implication is that you should not let them control natural monopoly completely. And I disagree, yes, but I disagree that it's that the only way that you cannot have fragmentation of the monopoly. You just have to have platforms that speak to each other. And this is a failure of regulation and coordination of the regulation authorities throughout the world to regulate that. And this has happened before, right? So it happened with the railways, it happened. So as long as you don't regulate this massive natural monopoly, they acquire so much political power that then they want to use it. And then the other thing is that also competition on the platforms and making sure that the fake news or the post-truth world doesn't. So these are the 2 aspects. And I don't think that your model touches on.
No, it doesn't.
And so it is isomorphic to a model that would explain this, but it doesn't capture the aspects. So that would be my reviewer response to your model.
I agree. There's also an interesting aspect here because it's on this breaking down the monopoly principle, you can say, okay, you lose efficiency, but then you're gaining the control of X. So it's it can pay back, but again, because here, and I don't want to ask my question because I would rather to host, but I think it's an interesting aspect that can be looked at. Bob?
I was just, it seems to me that, if I've read it right, the political motive, the X, is kind of like almost like exogenous. It's like a hobby of the. And I'm always very suspicious in that, in the sense that there are lots of ways in which you can gain. You can gain. Ultimately, you can monetize lots of things. So I think that, and particularly in the modern era, with the way that you know, all sorts of you know, if you acquire control of one of these social media outlets, it used to be the case with newspapers, but I mean, once you get this power, there's all sorts of ways in which you can extend it and monetize it, and you don't know what they are at the moment. So I wonder whether you're in some ways being too generous to people like this, who are thinking that what they're doing is they've got a private, they're really committed to a particular agenda. Perhaps it could not be that really this is just a long, you know, they're thinking far ahead. They're not quite sure how they're going to use this power, but they're expecting to make money out of this.
I'm with you here. I mean, we could extend this and write kind of the Bond villain in there, and kind of where the ultimate goal is world domination. And then I can show you the parameters under which world domination will happen. I mean, that's very clear. I mean, that's one of the that's one of the avenues forward. I mean, we just have. I mean, now we could go back to very recent work of John Simoglu and Simon Johnson, kind of on technology and power and progress, and kind of where they show that kind of looking back in history, kind of that technology for long has always kind of propped up GDP and innovation and so on. However, mostly it has benefited in the end only a very tiny group of people. Kind of, which means if you have a look at GDP, I mean just total GDP today, GDP of the United States, fantastic, right? It shoots in the roof. If you have a look at distribution of GDP, kind of a median GDP per head or something like that, completely different story, right? And that's one of the major problems. So because the skewness of the income and wealth distribution increases so tremendously through technology. This is really, I think, where the new dimension is coming in, where kind of a very, very tiny group of people is getting so powerful. It's super dangerous. I've seen actually one documentary about Elon Musk, where a former, I guess, German defense minister who knows him apparently reasonably well said, okay, face it or not, but we have to kind of we as states, as the European Union, so have to adjust this one private individual as if he was a foreign state, because he has such multidimensional power that he is as strong as a state. And so if he wishes this or this or this, then stuff happens. And so we cannot just, so it completely changes the power dynamics. And given all of this, I mean, that what you've all said, I mean, I think you're right, and this is super dangerous. And so this paper is only one tiny glimpse. It will not solve the conundrum. So that's, I guess from that perspective, what would be interesting, that we can do this offline, kind of from you to get feedback, where you think that really, okay, Jens, this is too little a contribution as it stands, you really need to adjust, and whatever you need to make gamma endogenous or whatever, there needs to be more sugar. Or to say, no, actually, it's a nice starting point, and for all the other aspects, let's venture out in depth. That is input I would wish to.
Yes, one more question. Was it?
Yes, it's just like curiosity. Start linking the Amazon region as special military support the government. It provides a lot of surveillance in drug trafficking, also in deforestation. So I just wonder if the political damage in this situation is really the driver, or maybe the consequences of not having Starlink for the Brazilian government is much more related to other things than the political damage of not having this.
I mean, Thank you. I mean, this is great input because I mean, so this was the this was the objective function that I assumed, where it just said, okay, there is some p which is the political damage. Then I microfounded it by saying, look, it depends on unserved demand times some parameter gamma. But effectively, this political damage can also be political damage for the Brazilian law enforcement agencies who depend on this one technology to hunt down drug dealers in the ends or wherever. I mean, so this can be easily interpreted. And this would also then probably capture the Ukraine case more better, or the Gaza case better, right? At this very general level, without, I mean, this is basically the industrial organization interpretation. And that is a more general interpretation.
Can I add one point on this one? What is interesting here is the fact that we're living out at the moment, but there is competition between government or states. So Ukraine and Russia is a good example, My decision wanting to invest is not only a decision to look within my country, but also based on the competitor doing. And now you can have a super firm, a firm that is basically in both countries with a lot of power, because at that point, competition with the states and a single monopoly firm. That is another way to think of this complexity of the model, and then, but that's it. Okay, thank you so much. I think
We thank you everybody online.